Hello landlords, it's Ernie Garcia, landlord attorney, and today we're talking all about the 5 things you must have before that tenant moves in. Let's get started. So over and over again, I talk to landlords about best practices when it comes to bringing in a new tenant, because even better than a winning argument in a court case is a court case that never has to go to court. So what can you do to ensure that you have the best possible tenant occupying your rental property? I'm going to give you those 5 tips right now. The first thing you can do is make sure that you've done a thorough background check. If you are skimping on your background check, you are just opening the door wide open to some of these career tenants who are really good at taking advantage of landlords who never seem to see the problem coming from a mile away. Remember that a good background check involves checking a criminal history, credit history, rental history, and employment history. You want to know that your ideal tenant has a certain longevity with an employer or has no criminal record, no felonies anyway. You want to know that your ideal tenant has a certain credit score and no evictions. But before you get to that spot, you have to have in mind what your ideal tenant is. So make sure that you are formulating in your mind what your ideal tenant is. You've established the definition of your ideal tenant, and then you're going out and doing a thorough check on each applicant that comes before you so you know whether or not that applicant matches what is your ideal tenant criteria. In previous videos, I have talked about a tenant scorecard, and I still wholeheartedly believe that if you're grading your applicants in accordance with what your ideals are for each of these situations, you're going to do a thorough background check and it's going to pay off. This next one should really go without saying, but over and over and over, I see landlords who fail to get this step done. Make sure that your unit is in excellent condition for that next tenant. Don't simply get rid of your last tenant and say, it's good enough, go ahead and bring someone in. If they don't like it, they don't have to rent. Instead, you should make it a habit of prepping your unit in such a way that it's attractive every single time a prospective tenant comes on. This helps you in a couple of ways. Number one, it'll attract a higher quality tenant to your property. But number two, it'll reinforce your claims if you're going to assess some kind of damage against a tenant. If there was already damage in the unit when the tenant occupied and you try to claim that additional damage was caused, you might have a proof problem. Because if 10 things are broken and you're trying to claim a couple extra things later, the court may disregard this claim because it's likely that those 2 things were also in disrepair if so many other things already were. However, if your property is in tip-top shape and a couple things end up broken after a tenant leaves, then it becomes more likely that, in fact, the tenant was responsible for those damages caused because you have a record of the condition of the property. That excellent condition status is going to help you out, both to attract better tenants, but also to protect you when tenants violate your lease and damage your property. Number 3, we kind of take it for granted that our lease is ready to go year after year after year, but leases can be stagnant. And if you haven't updated your lease in a while, or if you don't use a lease that is routinely updated by an association or perhaps by your legal counsel, you might find yourself using a lease that no longer comports with state law. You're going to want to make sure that you get your lease reviewed by some real estate professional to make sure that any changes that have recently occurred in the law are reflected in your lease. You want to make sure each time that your lease satisfies baseline requirements out of the property code, as well as grants you the protections you need in order to be an effective landlord. Perhaps you are recently curious about the lease that you've been using and you go and take it to somebody and they point out that X, Y, and Z are missing from your lease and should be added to it. This might be a good time when you're in between tenants to go and just ask those questions. Am I using an adequate lease? Am I protected? Does it give me all the firepower I need in order to be an effective landlord? Landlords, as always, we welcome you to follow us on our Instagram page. If you're not a member yet, join us on Facebook. And if you enjoy what you see here, give us a thumbs up. Click that like button. We enjoy that very much. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Next, before that tenant ever occupies your rental unit, you need to have what I call the talk. You need to sit your tenant down and let them know what your expectations are for their use of your rental. This is something that I stress with landlords because so many of the problems that we see 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the line are things that could have been prevented if the tenant simply knew up front that these were your expectations. There's no reason for you to come in and be disappointed or to come in 4 or 5 months later and see that something is not happening when you didn't give your tenant a fair shot. Make sure if there are things that are otherwise not identified or perhaps not clear in your lease that are specific to your rental unit that you want done, make sure that before you hand over those keys to a new tenant that you've sat them down and touched on those key points. Don't take it for granted that your tenant is going to read the lease. And don't take it for granted that the tenant is aware. This may be the first time that they occupy a rental unit, or perhaps they're coming from an apartment complex and now into a single family home. And so that dynamic is different. You're going to want to sit down with all of your tenants, whether they've done this for 20 years or whether this is their first go, and make sure that you talk to them about your expectations. Maybe there are specific expectations having to do with your homeowners association, or maybe you have equipment or other apparatus on your property that requires some kind of maintenance or attention, or that should be completely hands off. Perhaps there are quirks or different things that apply to your home, wood floors that need to be treated in a certain way, or some other kind of equipment that's located on the premises that otherwise is not specifically addressed in your lease. You'll want to have a sit-down talk with them and establish in writing, probably in your house rules, what your expectations are. If you are not having this talk with your tenants, you can kind of expect them to just figure things out on their own, and that might not be your ideal. In order for the tenant to know specifically what it is you want them to do, you got to have that talk. You got to let them know precisely what your expectations are. Don't just assume that all tenants are going to act the same way. And don't assume that they know precisely what it means to be a good tenant. If you lay this out for them, you are likelier to see a good result from a tenant with whom you have open communication. Finally, and this is probably the most important feature before a tenant ever occupies your property, and I hope you're getting this right every single time and not cutting corners here. If your tenant comes in and they do not have the full first month's rent and the full deposit, you're not signing that lease and you're not handing over those keys. Why? Because your tenant has already indicated to you that they are in breach of the agreement. This is day one. You cannot start off a lease agreement day one with a breach. That's already a terrible sign for you. And so you should know going to the table, right? So you're signing the lease that day. You should know they have certified funds to cover the rent and the full security deposit. Now, what that deposit is completely up to you. I suggest at least 1 month of rent. Sometimes it's more appropriate to have more than that. I don't know that it's ever appropriate to have less. But you are not handing over keys unless your tenant comes to the table, full first month, and full security deposit. If already you're having to make concessions for a tenant before you've ever handed over keys, you probably shouldn't be handing over those keys. It appears that if this tenant is not ready to go on day one, you can anticipate that sometime down the line there will be some other breach. Day one breaches are a terrible sign. Don't ever get sucked in. Don't ever be so attracted to the rent that you take a pass on the security deposit, or don't ever take just a promise of payment of security deposit. Oh, that'll come in a couple of weeks. I get paid then. because you have to understand that that payment is going to cascade, right? If they can't afford it now, there's something they won't be able to afford in the future, and that's probably eventually going to be the following month's rent. Take it from me, it's terrible for a tenant not to show up, again, day one, without that first month's rent and the full security deposit. Again, bad sign. Avoid that at all costs. Make sure that before you ever make your appointment to set up to sign, that it's very clear to your tenant that keys are handed over and a document is signed contingent on that first month rent and the full security deposit up front.